poverty, famine, and a dream of freedom. These three forces have carved the course of human history, driving millions from their homes in search of something more. We often hear of the great waves of Irish who fled to America in the 1840s. But tonight, we journey back to a different exodus, an older one, over 300 years ago. This is not the story of the Irish who landed in New York or Boston. This is the story of the Scots-Irish, a proud, hardened people who were forged in the fires of oppression in Ulster, and who would, in turn, forge a new identity in the most untamed wilderness the New World had to offer, the misty, ancient mountains of Appalachia. Their story is one of unimaginable hardship, of a journey across a deadly ocean, of a form of slavery called indentured, and of a brutal, decades-long struggle to carve a life from an unforgiving land. It is the story of how a people, pushed to the brink, became the backbone of a frontier, and how their culture, their music, their faith, their fierce independence, would become the soul of a region and a foundational element of the American character. This is not just a history. This is an epic, a 4-hour saga of survival. So settle in, adjust your pillows, dim your lights. Where we are going, you will need to be comfortable. We begin our story not on a ship, nor on a battlefield, but in a small, cramped, and damp cottage in the north of Ireland. The year is 1716. Dawn in County Antrim arrives as a grey, unwelcome guest. You do not wake because you are rested. You wake because you have to. The straw beneath your body has been pressed flat for months, offering no comfort from the hard, earthen floor. Every lump, every stone, seems to find a bone to press against. Your back aches. It always aches. The air is thick with the smell of peat smoke, of unwashed bodies, of the damp thatch overhead, and the faint, ever-present scent of chicken droppings. This is not a temporary hardship. This is what air smells like. This is your life. Your name is Eamon. You are 24 years old, but your body feels decades older. You are a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. As you pull on the same rough spun shirt you've worn for weeks, you do not own the roof over your head, the dirt under your feet, or the spade you will use to work it. You own nothing. Your grandfather told you stories. He came from the Scottish lowlands in 1650, lured by the promises of the Ulster plantation. The English crown, after crushing the Irish lords, needed loyal Protestants to hold the land. They offered grants, a fresh start, religious freedom. They called the settlers undertakers, and they promised a world of opportunity. They were beautiful, profitable lies. What your grandfather found was that he had simply traded one landlord for another. The undertakers owned everything, parceling it out to tenants like him, and now, like you. You work the land, you plant the crops, you harvest them, and in return, you get to keep perhaps a quarter of what you grow. If the harvest is good, if the weather holds, if the landlord's agent doesn't decide he needs more this year. Your wife, Margaret, is already moving in the dim light. She is always awake before you. The hearth needs tending, the oats need cooking, the baby needs feeding. There is no rest when you are living on the edge of starvation. Breakfast is a thin, watery porridge. You eat it with your fingers, sopping it up with a piece of hard bread that hurts your teeth. You eat it because you have to. Rinse due next week, Margaret says, her voice low. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't need to. You already know. The rent is always due. And you've heard the whispers, it's going up again. Here is the brutal mathematics of your existence. You are a Presbyterian. Your family has been for generations. You believe in a plain faith, a direct relationship with God, without the fancy rituals of the official Church of England. And here is the cruel irony. By law, you are forced to pay a tithe, a tax, to that very Anglican church. You must support priests you've never met, in buildings you are not welcome to worship in, while your own minister, Reverend Patterson, holds services in a leaky shed because you are forbidden to build a proper church. The hypocrisy is a slow-burning fire in your gut. It burns alongside the constant, dull ache of hunger. You step outside into the chill morning air. The sky is a flat, featureless gray. In the distance, you can hear the lowing of the landlord's cattle, grazing on the good pasture, the pasture you will never be allowed to use for your own animal, because you have no animal. You have nothing to sell but your own labor. Your neighbor, William, a man 20 years your senior with a back permanently bent from a lifetime of this work, is already in the field. He sees you and nods, a gesture devoid of cheer. They promised us religious freedom, William mutters, pulling a weed from the stubborn soil. Now we pay for their church while our own minister lives in a shed. It's not right. You work side by side, the rhythm of the labor as familiar as your own heartbeat. The field is a patchwork of struggling plants and rocky soil. You are constantly pulling stones from the earth, fighting the heavy clay. This land resists you. It always has. My grandfather, you say, your voice rough with fatigue. Glasgow, he was called. He said the agents showed them papers, made it sound like they'd be lords themselves. William spits into the dirt. I might have told me the same. All lies. Beautiful, profitable lies. The Ulster plantation was a grand scheme. By 1630, tens of thousands of Scots had been moved here, a human buffer against the native Irish. They were tools for the crown, and like all tools, they were used and then discarded when they were no longer convenient. They came hoping for ownership, but found only tenancy, a life of renting forever. You remember the stories of the Great Famine in the 1690s, just before you were born. The crops failed. People, your own people, starved to death. Villages were emptied. And what did the landlords do? They raised the rents. They saw desperation as an opportunity. My father used to say the soil here is cursed, you tell William. And in your heart, you are starting to believe it. The work is endless. 12, 14 hours a day, bent over the fields. After that, there is peat to cut for the fire, water to haul from the stream a quarter-mile away, tools to mend, a roof to patch. Margaret's work is just as hard. She tends the children, cooks, cleans, and spins linen from the flax you grow. The linen trade is your only source of cash, but the market is flooded. The price for a bundle of yarn keeps falling. Last year, it was 8 pence. This year, it's 6. Next year, it will be 5. The margins of your life are getting thinner every year. The gap between what you earn and what you owe is a chasm that is slowly swallowing you. My cousin sailed for Pennsylvania last spring. William says, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He says there's land there. Real land. A man can own it. No landlords. No tithes. No Crawford riding up on his bloody expensive horse. You've heard these rumors. Everyone has. A place called the Colonies. America. They say it's wild and dangerous, but they need people. They need settlers. They are practically giving land away. Hundreds of acres. The promise hangs in the air, tantalizing and terrifying. Could be lies. You say, the words tasting like ash. Like the lies that brought our grandfathers here. Could be, William agrees. But I'll tell you this. If the rent goes up one more time, I'm finding out. The sun climbs higher, but offers no warmth. Your day is just beginning. The weight of it feels physical, a yoke across your shoulders. You will work until you cannot see. Then you will collapse onto your straw mattress. And tomorrow, you will do it all again. And the day after, and the day after that. Because what choice do you have? But the seed has been planted. The impossible idea of leaving, of risking everything for a dream, has taken root. It is a dangerous thought, because hope can be the most painful thing of all. The final straw comes in the spring of 1718. It arrives on horseback, in the form of the landlord's agent, Crawford. He doesn't dismount. He looks down at you from his saddle, his face slick with sweat despite the cool air. New rent rate, he announces, holding out an official-looking paper. Takes effect next quarter. Landlord's orders. Your hand tightens on the handle of your spade. How much? 30%. The number hangs in the air, absolute and final. 30%. It is not a hardship. It is an impossibility. The math does not work. Even if you gave him every single oat you harvested, it would not be enough. That's impossible. You hear yourself say, your voice hollow. Crawford shrugs, a gesture of supreme indifference. Lots of folk wanting land. If you can't pay, someone else will. He turns his horse and rides away, leaving you standing in your field, your entire world shattered. Margaret is in the doorway. She heard. Her face is pale, but her eyes are hard. We're leaving, she says. It is not a question. It is a statement of fact. You look at her, at the determined set of her jaw, and you nod. The decision is made. The dream, however dangerous, is now your only plan. Within a week, the news has spread through the valley like wildfire. Half the families have made the same choice. There is a ship, the William and Elizabeth, scheduled to sail from the port of Larne in July. Its destination, Boston. The cost is £5 per adult, 3 for children. It might as well be £1,000. You do not have £5. You do not have £1. You have a few shillings, saved from the linen trade over years of scraping. So you do what you must. You sell everything. The pig you were fattening for winter. You get £2 for it. Less than it's worth, but the buyer knows you're desperate. You sell Margaret's spinning wheel, her grandmother's spinning wheel. She does not cry out, but you see the tears tracking silently through the grime on her cheeks as the merchant loads it onto his cart. You sell your father's spade, the last thing you owned of his. By the time you are done, you have enough for passage for yourself and Margaret. For the children, James, who is 7, Annie, who is 5, and the baby, John, there is only one option. They will become part of your indenture. You will sign a contract, a legal document that sells your own freedom, and that of your family, for the price of a ticket across the ocean. Indenture, a word that sounds clean, official. It means you are selling yourself into temporary slavery. Someone in America will pay your passage. In return, you will work for them, for no wages, for a set number of years, usually 7. 7 years of your life gone. Your children bound to the same master. If you die during those years, your contract can be sold, your family broken apart. It is a devil's bargain. But the alternative is to stay and watch your family slowly starve under the relentless pressure of the rent. We'll indenture ourselves, Margaret says, her voice steady. Work it off in America. I'm not indenting my children. You snap, the words harsher than you intended. I know, she says softly. I know. I don't know how much longer we can do this, Amen. You don't know either. That is the terrifying truth. You are 24 years old, and you are already broken. But you have made your choice. You are leaving the prison of promise for the uncertainty of a dream. The walk to Larne takes 3 days. You, Margaret, and the 3 children. Everything you own in the world is now contained in 2 cloth bags. On the 2nd day, Annie's worn-out shoes finally fall apart. You carry her the rest of the way. She is too light in your arms. They all are. When you finally see the port, It is chaos. The docks are teeming with hundreds, maybe thousands, of people, families from all over Ulster, all with the same desperate look in their eyes, all trying to get on ships, all trying to get to anywhere that isn't here. The William and Elizabeth is smaller than you imagined, much smaller, a wooden vessel, maybe 60 feet long. You watch as the crowd swarms around it. 200 people are meant to fit on this thing. The number is staggering. Margaret clutches baby John to her chest. "It's not possible," she whispers. William, who has arrived with his own family, stands beside you. "It's possible," he says, his voice grim. "It's just going to be miserable." The ship's captain, a man named Wilson with a thin, unsmiling face, barks orders. Below deck, families to the left, single men to the right. You get 4 feet of space per family. Make it work. 4 feet. For a family of 5. You are herded down a narrow hatch into the darkness. The air below decks is thick and foul, a mixture of tar, bilge water, and the ghost of past voyages. The ceiling is so low you cannot stand upright. You shuffle forward, bent double, until you find your allotted space against the hull. The planks are rough, unfinished wood. There is no straw, no mattress. This is your bed, your home, for the next 6 to 8 weeks. James looks up at you, his 7-year-old eyes wide. "Papa, is this an adventure?" You force a smile you do not feel. "Yes, son, an adventure." It is a lie. You are both aware it is a lie. For 2 days, you are kept in this floating dungeon while the crew loads cargo, barrels of water, sacks of oats, salted fish. You are allowed on deck for 1 hour a day. The rest of the time, you are in the dark with the smells and the sounds of 200 other desperate souls. The children cry. The babies wail. The parents have nothing to offer but empty promises. Finally, on July 29th, 1718, the ship is ready. You are allowed on deck for the departure. 200 people crowd the deck, watching as the green hills of Ulster recede into the distance. The land of your birth, the land of your suffering, becomes a dark line on the horizon. And then, nothing. You are on the open ocean. Nothing but water in every direction. The ship, which seems so large in the port, now feels impossibly small. A toy boat on a vast, uncaring sea. Captain Wilson's voice cuts through the wind. "Everyone below." You file back into the darkness, back to your 4 feet of space. The adventure is over. The ordeal has begun. And so, the great journey begins. For Eamon, for Margaret, for their children, and for the hundreds of thousands of Scots-Irish who would follow, the Atlantic crossing was a trial by fire, or rather, by water, disease, and despair. They called them Coffin Ships for a reason. In our next chapter, we will descend into the hell of the Middle Passage, witness the brutal reality of life aboard these vessels, and follow our family as they face death on the open ocean, all for the faint, flickering hope of freedom on the other side. The first week aboard the William and Elizabeth was not the worst. It only felt that way because they had not yet learned how much deeper misery could sink. The open Atlantic was a different beast from the sheltered waters of the Irish Sea. The ship no longer rocked. It was seized by the ocean, pitched and tossed like a toy in a tub. The result, for nearly every soul below deck, was a violent, relentless seasickness. The stench was the first thing to curdle. 200 people crammed into a dark, airless hold, their stomachs turning inside out. There were not enough buckets. The vile slurry of vomit and bile sloshed across the floorboards with the roll of the ship, seeping into the wood, into their clothes, into the very straw some had managed to bring. The air became a solid, suffocating thing, a mix of unwashed bodies, human waste from the few overflowing slop buckets, the tang of vinegar from the water barrels, and the pervasive reek of sickness. Eamon clung to the edge of their 4-foot space, his knuckles white. Next to him, Margaret held the baby, John, who had been crying, a thin, rasping wail, since they lost sight of land. Little Annie and James simply lay listlessly, their faces pale and clammy. There was no comfort to give. There was only endurance. The daily routine was a study in deprivation. Each person received a pint of water per day, a single pint, and it was not fresh, clear water. It was murky, stored in old barrels, and laced with vinegar to slow the growth of the foul things that bred in it. It tasted like metal and rot, but they drank it, their throats burning with thirst even as they swallowed. The alternative was a slow, agonizing death by dehydration. Food was a daily disappointment. More oats. The same oats they had crossed an ocean to escape. But these were worse, hard, dry, and often weevil-ridden. They had to be soaked in their precious water ration for hours to become merely edible. Twice a week, there was salt fish, so heavily cured it made their tongues swell and left them thirstier than before. It was protein, but it felt like punishment. The 1 hour of deck time became a sacred, fought-for prize. To feel the sun, to breathe air that didn't taste of death, to see the horizon, it was the only thing that kept madness at bay. But that hour was granted only when the weather was fair, and the North Atlantic in late summer was rarely fair. When the rains came, they were locked below, listening to the water drumming on the deck above, feeling the damp seep into their bones. It was during one of these brief respites on deck, clinging to the railing for stability, that William found Eamon. His face was grayer than the sea. "I heard someone died last night," William said, his voice low. "One of the families from Armagh. A baby, I think." Eamon's blood ran cold. He didn't respond, just looked back toward the hatch where Margaret was emerging, holding John. The baby had been fussy, wouldn't feed properly. His little face was flushed. "It's probably nothing," Eamon said to her, the words feeling hollow. Margaret just stared at him, her eyes sunken in dark hollows. She didn't believe him. He didn't believe himself. By the 3rd week, the deaths began in earnest. It started with the most vulnerable, the infants and the elderly. A fever swept through the crowded hold. There was no doctor, no medicine, only the grim ministrations of exhausted parents and the captain's hurried prayers. They wrapped the bodies in whatever cloth could be spared, a spare shirt, a cherished shawl, and carried them to the deck. Captain Wilson would say a few perfunctory words. "We therefore commit this body to the deep." And then, splash, gone, buried in a cold, anonymous grave thousands of feet deep. The ship sailed on, leaving no marker, no memory but the scars on the hearts of those left behind. For Eamon and Margaret, the nightmare became personal. Baby John's fussiness turned into a raging fever. His tiny body burned like a coal. His breathing became a wet, rattling struggle. "We need a doctor," Margaret pleaded, her voice cracking with a desperation Eamon had never heard before. "There is no doctor," Eamon replied, the truth a bitter pill. "There's barely a captain. They tried everything. They used their own precious water to wet rags for his forehead. Margaret gave him extra from her own ration, leaving herself weak with thirst. She held him, rocked him, sang to him the old Scots lullabies her mother had sung to her. But the fever would not break. On the 23rd day of the voyage, John died. He simply stopped breathing in Margaret's arms. One moment, he was a struggling, suffering little soul. The next, he was still. Margaret did not scream. She did not weep. She just held him, rocking back and forth, her face a mask of utter desolation. She was somewhere beyond grief, in a place where pain was so absolute it became silence. "Margaret," Eamon said, his own voice a broken thing. "Love, we have to." Captain Wilson's rule was absolute. No bodies below deck. Disease. Risk to everyone else. They wrapped their son in the only nice thing Margaret owned, her mother's hand-woven shawl. It was her last tangible connection to a home that was now gone forever. Eamon carried the small, heartbreakingly light bundle up to the deck. The sun was setting, painting the endless, gray water in hues of orange and blood red. Wilson said the words, "May God have mercy on his soul." Eamon stepped to the rail. He looked down at the churning water, then at the small bundle in his arms. He hesitated for a single, eternal second, then let go. The splash was tiny, insignificant. The ocean swallowed his son without a trace. Margaret, who had followed him up, turned without a word and walked back to the hatch, descending into the darkness without looking back. Eamon stood frozen at the railing, watching the sunset, the vast, empty horizon a mockery of his loss. He had sold everything, endured everything, and for what? To watch his child be fed to the sea. William came and stood beside him, a silent, solid presence. "It'll get better," William said, his voice rough. "In America, it'll be better." Eamon wanted to believe him. He wanted to grasp that straw of hope. But standing there, with the salt spray on his face feeling like tears he couldn't shed, he wasn't sure he believed in anything anymore. The voyage stretched on, a seemingly endless purgatory. 52 days. 52 days of darkness, hunger, thirst, and death. By the time a cry came from the crow's nest, land ho, 9 people from their ship had been committed to the deep. 9 souls who had begun the journey but would never set foot in the new world. The coast of New England was at first a smudge, then a line of dark green. Trees, actual, solid land. A frenzy of activity swept the ship. Those who could stand crowded onto the deck, their faces gaunt, their clothes hanging from their emaciated frames, but their eyes alight with a desperate, fervent hope. They stared at America as if it were salvation itself. Boston Harbor was a chaos of masts and sails, a forest of ships. The William and Elizabeth had to wait for a berth. They waited for hours, staring at the bustling port city. It was bigger, louder, and more intimidating than anything they could have imagined. "They'll be needing workers," someone muttered nearby. "That's why they let us come. They need us." Or maybe, Eamon thought, they just need bodies. Bodies to clear land, to fight natives, to do the work no one else would. It was a chilling thought. Finally, the gangplank was lowered. Captain Wilson stood at the top, his job complete. "Welcome to the new world," he said, his tone flat and devoid of welcome. "God help you all." One by one, the survivors of the William and Elizabeth stumbled onto the solid wood of the dock. Their legs, accustomed to the constant motion of the sea, buckled and wobbled. They moved like drunks, clutching each other, their feet unsure on the unmoving ground. But they were here. They had survived the Coffin Ship. The relief was short-lived. The dock was a marketplace of human misery. Well-dressed men, plantation owners, farmers, merchants, moved through the crowd, their eyes critically assessing the new arrivals. They were looking for strong backs, for capable hands. They were shopping for labor. Eamon stood with his family, what was left of it. Margaret held Annie and James close, her eyes vacant, still lost in her grief. They were a pitiful sight. Thin, dirty, dressed in rags, their faces etched with the trauma of the crossing. A man approached. He was clean, his clothes fine, his face impassive. He looked Eamon up and down, then did the same to Margaret and the children. "You're indentured?" he asked, his voice neutral. "I am," Eamon replied. "How many years?" 7. The man nodded, a businesslike gesture. He reached out and took Eamon's hand, turning it over to inspect the palm, the calluses. He looked at his shoulders, then, shockingly, peered into his mouth to check his teeth, as if he were a horse. "You look strong enough. Can you work land?" "I'm a farmer." "We're a farmer," the man corrected. "Now you're mine for 7 years. Can you read?" The question surprised Eamon. "No, sir." A flicker of satisfaction crossed the man's face. An illiterate servant was easier to control. "Your wife?" he asked, turning his gaze to Margaret. "She can spin. Linen. Good at it." "The children?" "Old enough for light work." The man pulled a paper and a quill from his coat. "Here's the arrangement. 7 years' service. I pay your passage. All 5 of you. That's £16 I'm out. You work my land in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. I provide food, shelter, basic clothing. You get Sundays for church. At the end of 7 years, you get your freedom dues. 50 acres of land. That's the law. I follow the law. 50 acres. The number was staggering. More land than his family had ever dreamed of in Ulster. It was the dream, made tangible. But the cost was 7 years of their lives. "Sign here." Eamon took the quill. His hand, which had swung an axe and held a dying child, now trembled. This was the moment. He was signing away his freedom, his family's freedom. He made his mark, a rough X, on the paper. He could not write his name. "Good," the man said, rolling up the paper. "Name's Caldwell. Robert Caldwell. My farm's in the Shenandoah Valley. We leave tomorrow with a wagon train heading south. Be ready at dawn." He handed Eamon a copper disc, a token stamped with Caldwell's name. "Show this to the wagon master. He'll know you're mine." And with that, he turned and walked away. The transaction was complete. They had been purchased. Margaret finally looked at Eamon, her eyes empty. 50 acres, she said, her voice a flat echo. "In 7 years," Eamon replied, the words feeling like a life sentence. William found them a moment later, his face grim. "I got bought too," he said. "A man named Peterson, a farm in Pennsylvania, leaving in 3 days." The reality of their situation crashed down upon them. After everything, the crossing, the death, the survival, they were to be separated. Their community, their last shred of familiarity, was being torn apart. "Pennsylvania's supposed to be good land," Eamon said, the words feeling inadequate. "And Virginia's supposed to be beautiful," William replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe after 7 years, we'll both be landowners. Maybe we'll be neighbors again." They both knew it was a frail hope. 7 years was a lifetime on the frontier. They clasped hands, a firm, desperate grip. "Take care of your family," William said. "You too." And then William was gone, walking toward his own unknown future, leaving Eamon and Margaret alone on the bustling dock, surrounded by 1,000 strangers, owned by a man they had just met, and facing a journey deeper into a wilderness they could not comprehend. The ocean crossing was over, but the real struggle for survival was just beginning. The Coffin Ship had delivered them, but into a new form of bondage. Indentured servitude awaited, a system that promised freedom at its conclusion, but was often little better than slavery while it lasted. Eamon and his shattered family, now the property of Robert Caldwell, would next turn their faces south, toward the wild, contested lands of the Virginia frontier. Their story of survival would continue, not on the tumultuous sea, but in the deep, silent, and equally dangerous forests of Appalachia. The bustle of Boston Harbor was a different kind of storm, not of wind and water, but of humanity and commerce. For Eamon and his family, the solid ground still felt like it was pitching beneath their feet, but there was no time to find their land legs. They were property now, and property has a schedule to keep. They spent their first night in the new world huddled behind a stack of wooden crates, the 2 cloth bags containing their entire lives serving as pitiful pillows. Margaret held Annie and James close, her body a shield against the unfamiliar sounds and dangers of the port city. She had not spoken since they buried John at sea. Her silence was a wall, and Eamon did not have the strength to scale it. Dawn brought not relief, but the grim reality of their new status. Robert Caldwell's wagon train was assembling, a line of 20 wagons piled high with barrels, sacks, and crates, everything needed to carve civilization from the wilderness. The families who had paid their own passage, the freemen, found spaces in the wagons. They looked at the indentured servants with a mixture of pity and disdain. They were the cargo that walked. Caldwell's overseer, a man named Briggs with a face like knotted rope and eyes that missed nothing, called the roll. He held a ledger, checking names against the copper tokens each indentured family carried. Eamon, family of 4. To Caldwell, Eamon said, holding out his token. Briggs glanced at it, made a mark in his book without. Looking up, you walk. Keep up, fall behind, and you'll be left. Your contract will be sold to the first taker, and your time starts over. Understood? The message was clear. They were investments, and a lost investment was a financial loss, not a human tragedy. The journey south was a brutal, dusty parade of exhaustion. The road was little more than a widened trail, a scar of mud and rock through an endless, towering forest. Annie's feet, still bare, were cut and bleeding within the first day. Eamon carried her until his shoulders screamed, then put her down, her cries of pain a fresh torment. James, trying to be the man of the family at 7 years old, marched on with a stubborn silence that broke Eamon's heart. They were not alone in their misery. The other indentured families formed a silent, trudging column of the damned. They kept to themselves, their spirits as broken as their bodies. But one family, the Andersons, John and Kate, with their 2 older boys, drifted toward Eamon's. Shared suffering built quick, quiet alliances. "Where's Caldwell taking you?" John Anderson asked, his Scottish accent thicker than Eamon's. "Shenandoah Valley," Eamon replied, his voice raspy from dust. "Same. They're opening the valley up. Need workers to clear the land. Free men won't do it. Too dangerous." Eamon looked at the forest pressing in on them. The trees were immense, ancient, their canopy blocking out the sun. It felt hungry. "You ever done this kind of work? Clearing this?" John gave a short, humorless laugh. "Farming? Aye. This." He gestured at the primordial wilderness around them. "No, nobody has. That's why they need us." After 3 weeks of walking, their food a scant ration of corn mush and tough salt pork, they reached the frontier settlement. It was a cluster of perhaps 10 rough-hewn log cabins, surrounded by stumps and struggling fields. This was the pinnacle of civilization in the Shenandoah Valley. Caldwell's farm was 2 miles further into the wilderness. When they arrived, there was no farm. There was only forest, and a single, crude cabin, about 20 feet square, with a dirt floor and a hole in the roof for smoke. "Get settled," Briggs said, dismounting from his horse. He wouldn't be staying here. "Start clearing tomorrow. Caldwell wants 20 acres ready for planting by spring." Eamon stared at the trees, a solid wall of wood. 20 acres. It was an impossible demand. John Anderson voiced what they all were thinking. That's not possible. It's possible. Eamon said, his voice flat. It's just going to kill us. The cabin was their new home. 12 people, Eamon's family, the Andersons, and 2 other indentured men, in a single room. There were no beds, no furniture. They slept on the hard-packed earth, huddled together for warmth. That first night, Eamon could hear the quiet, desperate crying of adults who had run out of hope. Dawn came, and with it, Briggs and the tools. Axes, saws, spades. They were rough, heavy, and unforgiving. You break a tool, that's added to your contract, Briggs announced, his voice cutting through the morning chill. You lose a tool, that's added to your contract. You understand? Start with the trees closest to the cabin. And so, they began. The first swing of Eamon's axe against a massive oak was a revelation. The blade bounced back, barely making a dent. The wood was like iron. It took 3 men a full day to bring down a single large tree, then another day to cut it into pieces. The stumps remained, immovable monuments to the scale of their task. The work was a slow, systematic destruction of their bodies. Blisters formed, burst, and formed again, until their hands were covered in a leathery crust of calluses. Their shoulders and backs were a constant landscape of pain. Margaret and Kate and the other women worked just as hard, cooking over an open fire, hauling water from a distant creek, tending a small vegetable patch, trying to keep the children from getting sick or lost. The children worked too. James, small for his age, carried branches. Annie, her feet now wrapped in scraps of leather, stirred pots and minded the fire. Childhood was a luxury no one could afford. Months bled into seasons. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the fiery red and gold of autumn, which in turn surrendered to a winter far colder and sharper than any they had known in Ulster. The cabin was an icebox. They burned green wood that smoked and choked them, the cold seeping into their bones. James fell ill, a deep, wet cough that echoed horribly in the small cabin. It was the sound that had killed baby John. Margaret, who had been a ghost since the ship, was jolted back to life by terror. Not again, she whispered, her first words in weeks. She fought for James's life with a ferocity Eamon had forgotten she possessed, nursing him day and night until, miraculously, the fever broke. His survival was a small, hard-won victory in a war of attrition. Spring arrived, a season of mud and rain. They had cleared maybe 5 acres. 5 out of the demanded 20. When Caldwell rode out to inspect the progress, his face was a mask of cold displeasure. "This is all," he said, not looking at them, but at the stumps and mud. "Sir, the winter was hard," John Anderson began. "I don't care about the winter," Caldwell interrupted, his voice flat. "I said 20 acres by spring. This is 6. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. It was their indenture contract. "You failed to meet your obligations. I'm adding 2 years to each of your contracts." The pronouncement landed like a physical blow. 7 years had just become 9. "That's not legal," John protested, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I can, and I did," Caldwell said, his eyes devoid of any humanity. "You want to argue? The nearest magistrate is in Winchester, 60 miles east. He happens to be my cousin. Good luck with that." He rode away, leaving them standing in the mud, their futures stolen with a few words. That night, around a meager fire, one of the men whispered the dangerous word. "We should run." "And go where?" John asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "We've no money, no supplies, no knowledge of this land. We'd be dead in a week, or the natives would get us. Briggs had made the consequences of running clear. They would be hunted, and if caught, 3 years would be added to their time. The wilderness itself was their prison walls. So, they did not run. They endured, because stopping meant dying, and they had come too far to quit. Years passed. The 3rd year, the 4th, the 5th. Eamon's body changed, hardened. He was no longer a farmer from Ulster. He was a machine of labor, his movements efficient, his strength born of necessity. He learned the forest, its rhythms and secrets. He learned to hunt from Briggs, not out of kindness, but because a servant who could provide meat was a more valuable asset. It was on one of these hunts that Eamon first encountered the true owners of this land. A Cherokee man, younger than him, stood watching from the trees. They froze, staring at each other, muskets held but not raised. Then the man simply pointed, showing Eamon the trail of a wounded deer. It was a gesture not of threat, but of assistance. This silent, cautious relationship grew. The Cherokee, whose name was Tsali, taught Eamon which plants were edible, where the deer trails ran, how to set fish traps in the creek. In return, Eamon showed him how to repair a musket lock. It was a fragile, wordless trade, a thread of humanity in the brutal wilderness. It was also a dangerous secret to keep from the other settlers, who saw all natives as savages. Back at the cabin, life was a grim cycle of work and sleep, but slowly, imperceptibly, a change was occurring. Margaret began to speak again, her sentences short, her smiles rare, but she was returning to the world. Annie and James were growing, learning the skills of frontier survival as naturally as city children learn the streets. The seasons turned, year after grueling year. The cleared land slowly expanded. 15 acres, then 18. The crops they planted, corn, beans, squash, were meager at first, but they were food. They were not starving. Finally, in the spring of 1727, 9 years after they had signed their lives away on the Boston dock, the day arrived. Caldwell came, papers in hand. "You've completed your service," he said, the words devoid of ceremony. He handed Eamon his freedom dues, a paper officially recording his grant of 50 acres on the western edge of the valley. Eamon held the paper. He couldn't read the words, but John Anderson could, and he confirmed it. It was real. 50 acres. Theirs. Margaret cried. Not the silent tears of grief, but tears of overwhelming, disbelieving relief. "We're free," she whispered, clutching the paper as if it were a holy text. "We're actually free." They walked away from Caldwell's land that day, their backs straight for the first time in years. They walked away from the cabin they had built, the fields they had cleared with their own blood. They walked away as free settlers. Their 50 acres were 3 miles northwest, near the creek where Tsali had taught Eamon to fish. It was untouched forest, just as wild as the land they had first seen 9 years before. But it was different now. This was not a prison sentence. This was a beginning. They stood on their land. Their land. James, now a strong 16-year-old, looked at his father. "Where do we build?" Eamon looked around, seeing not an impenetrable wilderness, but a future. He knew where the sun would fall, where the water was, where the best soil lay. "Near the creek," he said, a real, unforced smile finally touching his lips. Close to water, but high enough to avoid the floods. He had been planning this in his head for 9 years. They had nothing but their freedom and the clothes on their backs. But they had something more valuable than anything they had ever possessed. They had hope, born not from a dream, but from a promise they had finally, painfully, earned. Freedom had been purchased with 9 years of brutal labor, but the challenge of building a life from nothing on a wild frontier was just beginning. For Eamon and his family, the dream of ownership was now a reality, but the wilderness does not surrender easily. In the next chapter, we will witness the birth of a homestead, the forging of a new community, and the complex, often violent, relationships that would define the Appalachian frontier. The sound that defined their new life was not the cry of a bird or the whisper of the wind, but the solid, percussive thwack of an axe biting into virgin timber. It was a sound of possession, of defiance, of creation. For Eamon, each swing was a declaration. This tree was on his land. This would build his home. The first task was the cabin. It was just him and James at first, 2 sets of hands against the immense, ancient forest. Margaret and Annie worked alongside them, dragging cut branches, mixing clay and moss for chinking, hauling water from the creek. There were no overseers here, no masters, only a family united in a single, monumental purpose. The cabin they raised was small, 16 by 20 feet, a single room that would have felt familiar to them back in Ulster. But for one profound difference, it stood on dirt they owned. The logs were notched and fitted with a skill Eamon had learned through 9 years of brutal practice. The roof was made of hand-split shingles. The door was a slab of wood on leather hinges. The floor was packed earth. The windows, mere openings covered with oiled paper. It was crude, drafty, and leaky. But when Margaret stood in the doorway for the first time, her eyes shone. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Eamon gestured at a crack in the wall where the chinking had already shrunk. "It's falling apart already." She turned to him, a real, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "It's ours. That makes it beautiful." They had arrived too late for a full spring planting, but they put in corn, beans, and squash in the rocky, root-tangled soil they had managed to clear around the cabin site. The harvest would be meager, but it would be theirs. The scraggly milk cow they had bought with their meager savings, a creature that looked more skeleton than beast, miraculously survived and even gave a trickle of milk. It was a luxury they had almost forgotten. This was the dream, but the wilderness was a jealous god, and it demanded constant tribute. A few days after they had moved in, Eamon saw a familiar figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Tsali. The Cherokee man observed the cabin, his expression unreadable. He walked the perimeter of the property, his eyes noting the creek, the lay of the land, then gave a slow, approving nod. "Good spot," he said, his English more confident now. "Creek never dries up. Good hunting near. Soil is good. Will your people mind me being here?" Eamon asked, the question that had been weighing on him. Tsali shrugged, a gesture of profound and weary realism. "This land was for hunting. Now is for farming. Times change. Your people keep coming, like water. Can't stop water." He paused, his gaze intense. "Others are not like you. Others kill everything. Take everything. This is bad." He was speaking of the new settlers arriving monthly, families flush with desperation and a sense of entitlement from the colonial government. Men who saw the forest as an enemy to be annihilated and the Cherokee as obstacles to be removed. "There will be trouble," Tsali said, his voice low. "My chiefs are angry. Your chiefs want all our land. War is coming." "When?" Eamon asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "I don't know. Years, maybe. But coming." He looked directly at Eamon. "When war comes, you will have to choose. Your people or friendship with us." He left Eamon with that impossible choice hanging in the air, a shadow over his hard-won freedom. The first year was a relentless battle against starvation and exposure. The corn yield was pitiful. The bean vines struggled. They survived on what Eamon could hunt and the few fish from the creek. The deer skins he harvested became their currency. A single buckskin was worth $1, a buck, at the trading post that was slowly growing into a small settlement. He saved every one, a slowly growing pile of leather that represented future nails, a plow, perhaps even a gun of his own. It was during this time that the community began to knit itself together. The Andersons had their plot a few miles east. Other freed indentures settled nearby. They were a motley collection, Scots-Irish, a few Germans, all bound by shared hardship. There were no authorities to appeal to, no sheriffs to call. Their survival depended on mutual aid. When a bear tore through John Anderson's chicken coop, it was Eamon and James who helped him track and kill it. When Kate Anderson fell ill with a fever, it was Margaret and Annie who moved into their cabin for a week, tending to her and her family. When a new family arrived, green and hopeless, everyone contributed a spare tool, a sack of seed corn, a few words of hard-earned advice. This was the birth of the Appalachian Code. You help your neighbor because your survival might depend on them tomorrow. You take care of your own. You are suspicious of outsiders, but fiercely loyal to those within your circle. The following spring, a new complication arrived. A young Cherokee man appeared at the edge of Eamon's clearing. He was Tzali's nephew. "I am Waya," he said, struggling with the English words. "My uncle. He says you are a good man. Says I can learn from you. Trade work for learning." Eamon was skeptical. "What do you want to learn?" "Metalwork. English words. How white men build. How they farm." The young man's face was earnest. "My people. We must learn, must change, or we die." Eamon saw the truth in it. The tide of settlement was irreversible. Adaptation was the only path to survival. He agreed. Waya built a lean-to near the cabin and worked with a quiet intensity. He learned quickly, and Eamon noticed the looks that passed between Waya and his 16-year-old daughter, Annie. They were careful, respectful, but unmistakable. Margaret saw it too. "What do we do?" she asked Eamon that night, her voice tight with worry. "Do about what?" "Annie and that boy. He's Cherokee, Eamon, and she's a young woman." Eamon replied, his voice softer than he expected. "If they care for each other, who am I to stop them? We left across an ocean to be free of other people's rules." Margaret sighed, the sound full of a mother's fear. "Your children would be mixed. Both and neither. Do you know how hard that would be?" "I've seen hard, Margaret," Eamon said, looking into the fire. "Love isn't hard. Love is the easy part." The frontier was redrawing the lines of family and community, creating new bonds that defied the old world's prejudices. As the years turned, the wilderness slowly began to yield. Eamon's farm grew. A proper barn rose, then a smokehouse. The fields, now more thoroughly cleared, produced better harvests. The small orchard they planted began to bear fruit. They were not prosperous, but they were secure. They were rooted. James, now a man, began clearing his own adjacent 50-acre grant. He married Rebecca, a daughter of a German settler, and built his own cabin. The family was spreading, putting down taproots that would hold for generations. One evening, Eamon stood with John Anderson, looking out over the valley. The sun was setting behind the ridges, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Below, they could see the faint lights of a dozen cabin windows, dots of warmth in the vast, darkening wilderness. "Remember when we first got here?" John said, puffing on a pipe. "Thought we'd die that first winter." "Nearly did," Eamon agreed. John gestured with his pipe at the scattered lights. "And now look, cabins everywhere. Farms, families. We built this. Us and people like us. We built this. Eamon nodded. They had. They had taken the howling wilderness and, through sheer, stubborn will, had carved out a place. They had paid for it in blood, sweat, and years of their lives. But as he looked at the lights of his son's home, heard the distant sound of Annie's laughter from where she sat with Wyatt, and felt Margaret's hand slip into his, he knew it had been a price worth paying. The wilderness was no longer howling. It was home. The frontier had been tamed, not by armies or governments, but by the stubborn perseverance of families like Eamon's. A new culture was being born in these isolated valleys, a blend of old-world traditions and new-world realities. But the very success of these settlers was creating tensions that would soon explode into violence. The peace they had built with their own hands was about to be shattered by the distant drums of empire. The peace of the valley was a fragile thing, a thin veneer over old hatreds and new ambitions. For years, the shadowed Solly had spoken of had grown longer, cast by empires clashing an ocean away. The wilderness, which Eamon and his neighbors had fought so hard to tame, was about to become the stage for a global war. It was a conflict that would not be fought by neat lines of red-coated soldiers, but by stealth, terror, and fire in the deep woods. The British and the French were fighting for a continent, and the settlers of the Appalachian frontier were the pawns caught in the middle. The first sign was the silence. The deer seemed to vanish from the woods. The birdsong felt muted. Wyatt, who had become a regular presence at the homestead and was now openly courting Annie, grew tense and withdrawn. He spent long hours speaking in hushed, urgent tones with his uncle, Solly, who had grown old and grim. The French agents are in the Cherokee towns, Wyatt told Eamon one evening, his face etched with worry. They bring many guns, much whiskey. They make big talks, big promises. They say if the Cherokee help them drive the English into the sea, the French will keep the settlers east of the mountains forever. Eamon felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The promise was a lie, he knew, but it was a powerful one. To the Cherokee, the unending tide of settlers like Eamon was an existential threat. The French offered them a chance to turn it back. And your people? Eamon asked, dreading the answer. What will they do? Wyatt looked away, torn between his love for Annie and his loyalty to his people. The chiefs are divided. The young men, their blood is hot. They listen to the French promises. They see the cabins, the cut forests. They are angry. The war, when it came, did not arrive with a declaration. It arrived with smoke. It was James's wife, Rebecca, who saw it first, a thick, black column rising from the direction of the Henderson farm, 5 miles to the south. By the time Eamon, James, and other men from the settlement reached it on horseback, there was nothing left. The cabin was a heap of smoldering ash. The Hendersons, mother, father, and 3 children, were gone, not buried, but taken. The only thing left behind was a war club, dropped in the mud, and a single, terrifying arrow, fletched in a style none of them recognized. It was not a random attack. It was a message. Panic, cold and sharp, swept through the valley. The isolated homesteads that had represented their freedom were now death traps. Families abandoned their hard-won farms and crowded into the central settlement, which they hastily fortified with a log palisade. It was a return to the crowded, fearful existence of their first winter. But now the enemy was not the cold, but an unseen, terrifying foe who knew the land better than they did. Eamon stood guard on the palisade wall one night, his old musket heavy in his hands. John Anderson stood next to him, his face aged a decade in a week. The British, where are the British? John muttered, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. "We send word to Williamsburg, and they send promises. Promises don't stop a tomahawk." The following week, a rider from Winchester finally arrived, his horse lathered in sweat. He brought news of a young Virginia militia colonel named George Washington, who had been defeated at a place called Fort Necessity. He brought word of formal war between Britain and France, and he brought a demand. Every able-bodied man was to join the militia and prepare to defend the frontier. James, now a father of two himself, was among the first to step forward. "I'm not fighting for the British crown," he told Eamon, his jaw set. "I'm fighting for this." He gestured at the cramped, frightened settlement, at his own family huddled in a corner. "For this land, for them." Eamon, too old for campaigning but burning with a need to protect, joined the local militia company. They were not soldiers. They were farmers with guns. They drilled awkwardly in a muddy field, a ragtag collection of men in homespun, their rifles a mix of fine Pennsylvania long rifles and crude fowling pieces. Their commander was a pompous planter from the coast who knew nothing of frontier fighting. The war on the frontier was a brutal, no-quarter conflict. There were no grand battles, only ambushes and raids. A man would go out to check his snares and never return. A child would wander too far from the palisade gate. The fear was a poison in the water, turning neighbor against neighbor, suspicion into paranoia. The delicate bonds Eamon had forged were the first to snap under the strain. One afternoon, Wyatt came to the palisade gate. He was alone, and he carried no weapon. He asked for Annie. The sentry, a man named Dobbs who had lost a cousin to a raid, leveled his musket. "Get away from here, savage," he snarled. Eamon heard the commotion and rushed over. "Lower your gun, Dobbs." "He's with me." "Is he?" Dobbs spat, his eyes wild. "How do we know he ain't scouting for them? How do we know his whole family ain't waiting in the woods to lift our hair?" The crowd that gathered murmured in agreement. The fear on their faces had hardened into hatred. Wyatt saw it. He looked from their angry faces to Eamon, his own expression a mask of pain and understanding. "I cannot come here anymore," he said to Eamon, his voice quiet. "My uncle's town they have chosen. They will fight with the French." He looked past Eamon, hoping for a glimpse of Annie. "I must go with my people." It was the choice Solly had foretold. The war had forced it upon them. Wyatt turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Eamon standing at the gate, the mistrustful eyes of his neighbors burning into his back. The friendship that had saved his family was a casualty of the first volley. The war dragged on for years, a bloody stalemate of raid and counter-raid. Eamon's militia company was called out to bury the dead, to pursue raiding parties that vanished like ghosts, to stand guard over the smoldering ruins of farms. They grew hard and bitter. The wilderness they had loved became an enemy again. Every shadow a potential threat, every snapped twig a signal of death. Then, in 1758, the news came. A massive British army was on the move, not of redcoats, but of Scottish Highlanders and colonial troops, led by General Forbes. Their goal was to take the French stronghold of Fort Duquesne, the source of the weapons and encouragement for the raids. The Virginia militia was ordered to join them. James kissed his wife and children goodbye and marched off with the company. Eamon watched him go, the same cold fear he had felt on the Coffin ship gripping his heart. This was different. This was his son, the future of everything he had built. The months that followed were an agony of silence. Then, a ragged, exhausted man stumbled into the settlement. It was one of the militia. His clothes were in tatters, his eyes hollow. "Duquesne," he croaked, before collapsing. "We took it. The French." They blew it up and ran. It's over. On the frontier, it's over. A ragged cheer went up, but it was muted by exhaustion and grief. They had won. The French power was broken. The raids would stop. When James returned, he was a changed man. He had seen the organized slaughter of a European-style battle, the chaos of wilderness fighting. He had killed men. He had watched friends die. He carried a quietness in him that had not been there before. The war officially ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. The French were gone from North America. The British crown now ruled everything east of the Mississippi. Eamon stood with his family on their land. The woods were quiet again. The threat was gone, but nothing was the same. The trust between settler and Cherokee was shattered, replaced by a legacy of blood and bitterness. A generation of young men like James had learned the art of war, and a new, more ominous proclamation had come from London. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The same British government they had just fought for was now telling them they could not expand, that the land they had bled to secure was off limits. The victory felt hollow. They had fought a war to secure their future, only to have another master, an ocean away, try to dictate its limits. The fire in the wilderness had been put out, but the embers of a new, different rebellion were already beginning to glow. The French and Indian War had saved the frontier from one empire, only to bind it more tightly to another. The settlers had proven their toughness, but they had also learned a dangerous lesson, that distant powers saw them as disposable. As the British crown, buried in debt from the war, began to impose new taxes and new laws to control its expanded empire, the fiercely independent people of Appalachia would not forget that lesson. The fight for the land was over. A fight for a different kind of freedom was about to begin. Peace, after the French and Indian War, was a bitter and crowded affair. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, a line drawn on a map by a king who had never seen a mountain, declared the vast lands west of the Appalachians, the very frontier they had bled to secure, off limits. To the Scots-Irish settlers, it was a betrayal that tasted hauntingly familiar. It was the voice of a distant landlord, a new Crawford on a far larger estate, telling them what they could and could not do with land they had earned with their sweat and blood. Resentment festered in the valleys like a rot. It was fed by new taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, direct impositions from a parliament in which they had no voice. In the taverns and trading posts of the back country, the talk was not of tea and representation, but of land and liberty. They had not crossed an ocean and tamed a wilderness to be tenants of the crown once more. Eamon, now in his late 50s, his back permanently bent from a lifetime of labor, felt the old fire stirring. He stood with his son, James, now a hardened veteran of the last war, looking out over the valley they had built. Dozens of chimney smokes now rose from farms that had been empty forest. "They tax the molasses we need for our whiskey," James said, his voice low and hard. "They tell us we cannot trade for furs beyond the mountains. They tell us where we can and cannot go. It is Ulster all over again, father, just a wider ocean and a finer-dressed landlord." The conflict, when it ignited in the north with the shots at Lexington and Concord, felt distant to many, but not to the men of the Appalachians. For them, the war arrived in the form of a singular, personal threat. In the autumn of 1780, the word spread like wildfire. A British army was in the south. Under General Cornwallis, they had won a string of victories, and with them was a fierce commander of loyalist militia, a Scottish major named Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson, a professional soldier, saw the backcountry over mountain men as a rabble. He issued a proclamation, a boast that became a declaration of war. If the frontier settlers did not cease their rebellion and swear allegiance to the crown, he would, in his own words, march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. He had threatened the wrong people. In a clearing at a place called Sycamore Shoals, a miracle of frontier mobilization occurred. From the valleys and hollows of Virginia, North Carolina, and what would become Tennessee, they gathered. They were not soldiers in uniform. They were farmers, hunters, blacksmiths. They wore buckskin and homespun. They carried their own weapons, long, deadly accurate rifles that could kill at 3 times the range of a British musket. They were led not by gentlemen, but by men they knew and trusted. Shelby, Sevier, Campbell, Cleveland. They were the over-mountain men, and they were marching to hunt the hunter. James was among them. Before he left, he stood with his father. "I'll be back in a week," he said, the same confident, youthful boast Aemon had made a lifetime ago. "You better be," Aemon replied, the weight of all their years of struggle in his voice. He watched his son ride out with the militia. They were not marching to defend someone else's idea of liberty. They were marching to defend their homes, their land, their very right to exist free from a master's boot. It was a war they understood perfectly. Ferguson, arrogant and unaware of the storm he had provoked, retreated to a high, wooded ridge in South Carolina called Kings Mountain. He believed his position was impregnable. He did not understand the kind of men who were coming for him. On October 7, 1780, in a cold, drizzling rain, the over-mountain men surrounded the mountain. There were no formal lines of battle. Using the skills they had honed hunting deer and fighting Cherokee, they moved from tree to tree, rock to rock, their rifles picking off Ferguson's loyalists with terrifying precision from the cover of the woods. Ferguson's men, trained for European warfare, fired volleys into the trees, their smoothbore muskets useless at such range. The battle was a chaotic, close-quartered slaughter. The mountain echoed with the crack of rifles, the war whoops of the frontiersmen, and the screams of the dying. James, fighting alongside his neighbors, felt the strange detachment of the hunter. This was not a field of honor. It was a turkey shoot. They were wiping out the threat to their homes. Major Ferguson, a plaid coat over his uniform, rode frantically through the chaos, blowing his silver whistle, trying to rally his men. He became a shining target. A dozen rifles, fired from the shadows of the trees, found their mark. He tumbled from his horse, dead. With their leader gone, the loyalist resistance collapsed. In just over an hour, the battle was over. Ferguson's army was annihilated. It was one of the most complete and decisive American victories of the war. When the news reached the settlements, carried by exhausted, mud-spattered riders, the relief was explosive. Aemon felt a sob catch in his throat, a release of a fear he had carried for weeks. James was alive. Wounded, a British ball had gouged his shoulder, but alive. He was coming home. When James returned, he was different. The quietness he had carried back from the last war was now a deep, settled hollowness. He had seen the face of battle at its most brutal. He would not speak of it. He simply took up his axe and went back to clearing his land, as if he could chop the memories out of his head. But the victory at Kings Mountain had changed everything. It broke the back of the British campaign in the South. It proved that the fierce, independent spirit of the Appalachian settlers was a force that could defeat the finest army in the world. Cornwallis, his left flank exposed and his loyalist support shattered, was forced to retreat into Virginia, where he would eventually be trapped and defeated at Yorktown. The war was won. The United States of America was born. Eamon, now an old man, stood on his porch and looked out at the free country his son had helped to create. He had lived through it all: the oppression of Ulster, the Coffin Ship, the brutality of indentured, the terror of the wilderness, the fire of 2 wars. He had buried a child and watched his family grow and scatter across the land he had claimed. The mountains were the same, but the world was new. They were no longer subjects. They were citizens. The long, bloody struggle for the land was finally, truly over. He had crossed an ocean for this. His son had fought a war for this. And now, at last, they were free. The revolution was over, and the Scots-Irish had cemented their place as a founding force of the American character. Their fierce independence and warrior spirit had tipped the scales in the Southern campaign. But with the fighting done, a new challenge emerged. How would this hardened, isolated people, who had spent decades simply surviving, now turn to the task of building a lasting culture? In the peace that followed, the true, enduring soul of Appalachia would begin to sing its own unique song. The peace that followed the revolution was a different kind of quiet. It was not the fearful hush before a raid, but a deep, settling silence, broken only by the sounds of life, not death. For the first time in generations, the people of the Appalachians could lift their heads from the struggle for mere survival and begin to build a world, not just defend one. In the isolated valleys and hollows, a distinct culture, born of hardship and isolation, began to bloom like a hardy wildflower pushing through rocky soil. For Eamon, now an old man whose hands were more gnarled root than flesh, this new era was a time of reflection. He would sit on the porch of the cabin he had built, watching his son James and his grandson, William, work the land that was now truly, unquestionably theirs. The fear of landlords, the terror of raiders, the drumbeat of war, all were receding into memory, becoming the stories told by the fire. And it was by the fire that the new culture first found its voice point one Saturday. The sound that echoed through the valley was not a musket shot, but the lively screech of a fiddle. It was gathering day. From all over the county, families came to a wide field between the farms. They came on wagons and on foot, carrying not muskets, but baskets. The tables, made from planks laid across sawhorses, groaned under the weight of a feast that was a testament to their resilience. There was Rebecca's famous biscuits and gravy, a dish born of poverty, using every scrap of flour and fat, but now perfected into a creamy, soul-warming art. There was Kate Anderson's chow chow, a spicy, sweet pickle made from the last of the garden vegetables, a symbol of the refusal to waste anything the land provided. There was fried chicken, cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet, soup beans, and a blackberry cobbler made from fruit the children had picked. And everywhere there was whiskey, clear, potent, untaxed moonshine, distilled in hidden hollows from their own corn. It was more than a drink. It was a statement, a final, defiant middle finger to any authority, British or American, that dared tell them what to do. But the heart of the gathering was the music. A fiddler, his instrument brought from Scotland generations ago, started an old Highland lament. But as he played, his bow strayed, picking up a new, bouncing rhythm. Another fiddle joined, then a third. The sound was no longer purely Scottish or Irish. It was faster, freer, with a driving, percussive beat that echoed the rhythm of their axes and looms. Then, a new sound joined them. It was Wyatt, who had cautiously returned after the war, his relationship with Annie now an accepted, if still unusual, part of the community. In his hands was a gourd with a stretched skin and 4 strings. A banjo, an instrument with roots in Africa, learned from the few enslaved or freed black people in the region. The plunky, rhythmic drive of the banjo intertwined with the fiddles, and something new was born. It was raw, it was joyful, and it was uniquely theirs. This was the birth of what would be called mountain music, the ancestor of bluegrass and country. The young people began to dance. They didn't waltz. They danced flat-footed, their feet stomping and shuffling, creating a complex, percussive rhythm on the hard-packed earth. They called it buck dancing. It was energetic, unpolished, and full of a life that had been earned the hard way. Eamon watched, a rare, full smile on his weathered face. His daughter Annie sat nearby, her hand resting on Wyah's arm, their children, Eamon's grandchildren, playing at their feet. The children had dark hair and eyes that could be Cherokee or Scots-Irish, depending on the light. They spoke English with the mountain drawl that was developing, but they also understood the old Cherokee words from their father. They were the living embodiment of the new culture, a blend of all the strands that had been woven together in these mountains. Later, the women would gather. Margaret, her hair gone fully white, would sit with Kate Anderson and the other women, their hands flying as they worked on a quilt. The quilt was a mosaic of fabric, each scrap with a story. A blue square from James's childhood shirt, a red one from Margaret's best dress, a piece of rough linen from a long-gone trade. They used patterns with names like log cabin and wedding ring, stitching their history, their family, and their community into a blanket that would warm their descendants. This was their art, born from necessity, but elevated into a legacy. In the quiet moments, Eamon saw the values that would define this new Appalachian culture solidify. It was a culture of fierce independence, born from a history of resisting landlords and kings. It was a culture of deep mutual aid, where a neighbor's burned-down barn was rebuilt by the whole community without a second thought, because survival here had always been a collective effort. It was a culture of profound practicality and suspicion of outsiders, especially those who talked too fancy and promised too much. It was a culture that turned hardship into beauty. The hardscrabble land produced food that was simple, hearty, and delicious. The back-breaking work inspired music that was both mournful and wildly joyful. The poverty bred a craft tradition where nothing was wasted and everything could be made beautiful. Eamon's legacy was no longer just the land. It was this. It was the fiddle tune his grandson was learning. It was the taste of Rebecca's biscuits. It was the pattern in the quilt on his bed. It was the stubborn set of James's jaw, the same one he'd seen in his own father back in Ulster. The long, painful journey was over. They had not just found a new home. They had created one. The song of the mountains was their song, and it would echo for generations. A unique American culture had been forged in the crucible of the Appalachian frontier. But what would become of this world as the young nation expanded westward? In our final chapter, we will follow the descendants of Eamon as they carry their music, their traditions, and their fierce spirit across the continent, tracing the unbroken chain of the Scots-Irish legacy from these misty mountains to the modern world. Eamon died in the winter of 1786, 72 years old. They buried him next to Margaret on the hill overlooking the valley, where he could watch the mountains he had loved forever. James carved the headstone himself. It was simple, direct, the mountain way. His name, his dates, and one line. He crossed an ocean so we could be free. But the story did not end there. Stories like this never truly end. They are a river, fed by countless tributaries, flowing through time. The values Amen and his generation had forged in fire and blood, the fierce independence, the deep-seated loyalty to kin and community, the stubborn refusal to bow, did not lie buried with him. They were a living inheritance, passed down through the generations, shaping the destiny of a family, a region, and a nation. The first great test of this legacy was the call of the wider West. The same restless spirit that had driven their ancestors across the Atlantic now pulled Amen's descendants across the continent. His grandson, William, the boy who had listened wide-eyed to stories of Kentucky, was now a man, and the Cumberland Gap was no longer a barrier but a gateway. In the early 1800s, William and his young family joined the river of humanity, flowing down the wilderness road. They carried with them in their wagons the essential tools of Appalachian culture: a fiddle, a Bible, a rifle, and a quilt. They settled in the bluegrass hills of Kentucky, and there they did what their forebears had always done. They cleared land, built a cabin, and planted their roots. They took with them their speech, their music, their recipes, and their profound suspicion of distant authority. They were the vanguard, the carriers of the flame. But the wilderness was not the only challenge. The young nation Amen's son had helped create was tearing itself apart. By the 1860s, the issue of slavery and states' rights fractured the country, and the Civil War presented a cruel dilemma for the people of Appalachia. They were caught between the plantation aristocracy of the lowland South and the industrial power of the North. Their own economic interests and deep-seated loyalty to their home states pulled them toward the Confederacy, but their historic hatred of the wealthy planter class, the same breed as the English landlords they had fled, and a fierce love for the Union their fathers had fought for, pulled them the other way. The result was a bitter, internal civil war within the Civil War. Brother fought against brother, neighbor against neighbor in the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Western Virginia. It was a conflict that left scars deeper than any battle against the British or the French, a poison of division that would linger for a century. The mountain people fought, as they always had, for what they saw as their freedom and their land, and the cost was paid in blood and broken families. As the 19th century waned, a new master arrived in the mountains, one that promised prosperity but delivered a new kind of servitude: coal. The vast, ancient forests that Amen had struggled to clear were sitting atop the largest concentration of bituminous coal in the world. Industrialists from the north came with deeds and contracts, buying the mineral rights from often illiterate landowners for a pittance. The landscape was transformed. The serene, mist-shrouded valleys were now dominated by the dark, skeletal frames of tipples and the constant, mournful whistle of mine trains. The descendants of independent farmers, men who had answered to no one, now descended into the dark, dangerous earth every day. They traded the open sky for the constant, crushing fear of a cave-in or the slow, suffocating death of black lom. But the Appalachian spirit of resistance was not so easily broken. It found a new outlet in the labor movement. The coal wars of the early 20th century were some of the most violent class conflicts in American history. In places like Blair Mountain, West Virginia, thousands of armed miners, many of them descendants of Scots-Irish settlers, literally went to war against the coal company guards and private detectives. They fought with the same rifles their grandfathers had carried at Kings Mountain, battling for the right to unionize, for fair pay, for safe working conditions. They were fighting, just as Amen had, for dignity and a measure of control over their own lives. Through it all, the expansion, the Civil War, the industrial exploitation, the core of the culture endured, protected by the very isolation that had made life so difficult. In the remote hollows, the old ways persisted. The music evolved but remained rooted. The fiddle and banjo duets of Eamon's day gave rise to the high, lonesome sound of bluegrass in the 1940s, pioneered by men like Bill Monroe, whose own ancestry was Scots-Irish. The lyrics told stories of heartbreak, faith, and a deep connection to the land, the same themes that had always mattered. The food remained a testament to making do. Dishes like soup, beans, and cornbread, fried potatoes, and biscuits and gravy became staples not of poverty, but of identity. They were foods of sustenance and community, served at church suppers and family reunions. The crafts continued. Quilting bees remained social hubs, where women stitched their history into patterns like the double wedding ring and the log cabin, passing skills and stories from one generation to the next. And the attitude, that unique blend of hospitality and suspicion, of fierce pride and stubborn resilience, remained the bedrock of the Appalachian character. It was a worldview forged by centuries of being told what to do by outsiders, from English landlords to coal barons to government agents. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Appalachia was discovered again, this time by the media. It was often caricatured as a land of feuding hillbillies, a backward region left behind by progress. This was a profound misunderstanding. The people were not left behind. They had consciously held on to something. They had prioritized family and community over mobility, tradition over trend, a sense of place over a search for profit. Yet, their culture seeped out and became the bedrock of mainstream America. Country music, born in the mountains, became a national phenomenon. The outlaw streak in country, the suspicion of authority, is pure Appalachia. The nationwide love for bluegrass, for moonshine mythology, for hearty, simple food, all are testaments to the enduring power of this culture. Today, the legacy of Eamon and his kin is everywhere. It's in the lilt of a country singer's voice. It's in the artisan whiskey being distilled legally in Kentucky, a direct descendant of the untaxed moonshine of the hollows. It's in the nationwide quilt revival, where people seek a connection to handmade heritage. It's in the political rallies where a fierce, independent spirit is on full display. Drive through the small towns of the Shenandoah Valley today, and you will see names on mailboxes and storefronts that trace back to that first exodus. Anderson, Campbell, McDowell. The accent you hear is not quite Southern. It's the ghost of 18th century Ulster and the Scottish lowlands, preserved in the acoustic jar of the mountains. The descendants of Annie and Wyatt are still there, their family lines a living symbol of the complex, often painful, but ultimately resilient merging of peoples that built the region. Their story is the story of America itself. The mountains Eamon looked upon are still there, eternal and watchful. They have been logged, mined, and paved, but they endure. And so does the spirit they sheltered. It is a spirit that values freedom above comfort, community above wealth, and integrity above all. It is a spirit that remembers where it came from. The unbroken chain stretches from a damp cottage in Ulster to a frontier cabin in Virginia, from the ridge at Kings Mountain to the coal fields of Kentucky, from the fiddle tunes of the 18th century to the bluegrass festivals of the 21st. It is a chain not of DNA, but of values, of a stubborn, beautiful, and unyielding will to be free. The long journey that began with poverty, famine, and a dream of freedom did not end when Eamon found his land. It did not end when the revolution was won. It continues in everyone who carries a piece of that story in their heart, in everyone who values home, family, and the right to face the world on their own terms. The Song of the Mountains is not a relic. It is a living, breathing, enduring part of the American soul. And so, our saga concludes. From the desperate shores of Ireland to the misty peaks of Appalachia, the story of the Scots-Irish is a foundational American epic. It is a story of how a people, forged in oppression and hardened by wilderness, helped shape the character of a nation with their grit, their faith, their music, and their unbreakable will. This has been their story, and if you listen closely to the wind in the pines, you can still hear its echo.